Welcome to the AAE 320 video for partial budgeting. In this video, we'll start with our learning goals. First off is just to understand the purpose of partial budgets in farm management. What kind of the questions they are that they answer for a farm manager. And then the second learning goal is just to understand how to actually build and use one to do analysis in farm management. So let's start with the purpose here. The purpose is to analyze net gains from small changes or refinements to a farm operation. The key terms are small and refinements, not major changes. Tweaks is what we're talking here. It's also the term is used as partial budget. It focuses only on the parts that change. What's key about it is you do not need a full, complete enterprise budget for each enterprise you're looking at, which is what makes it useful. But that's also where the term comes from, partial budget. And I think it's the way to think of it. It's for fine-tuning your current operation. And you hold everything else fixed and then just make small incremental changes. A couple other terms that are used sometimes are incremental analysis or marginal analysis. And we'll come back to that again when we go on to the next section of the course. And I often think of this from a practical perspective is if you're looking at some sort of change, you often will do a partial budget, kind of like a back of the envelope calculation for some issue you're looking at, some change. And then if it looks promising, you might, or if you're not sure, you go and do a deeper level analysis, but it's often the first cut. And if things look fairly negative, you say, well, I looked, I'm not going to spend any more time on it. Or if it looks promising, you might circle back and do a lot more intensive and a little more comprehensive analysis. So here's some examples of the kinds of farm management decisions that you can examine using partial budget analysis. So you got your corn crop out there in the middle of summer, and normally you don't apply a foliar fungicide. Well, do I apply it this year? You want to look at that question. Maybe you've been using a custom combiner, and you want to look at, should I buy a combine? Which one should I do? Do I pay for a soil test for nitrogen on my corn, or just use the nitrogen credits? I can just quickly look at my rotational credit, got alfalfa, soybeans, I have a certain pounds breaker, I assume, for credit, or do I do a soil test in the spring to see if I really get that much nitrogen? Is it worth the extra cost to do that test, or is just using the credits fine? Should I replace my old silage chopper with a newer one? Maybe you've been using it a while and you're kind of wondering, what are the benefits and what are the costs of replacing my current silage chopper, which seems to be getting closer to the end of its life. Maybe you've been working on milking your cows, and you're thinking, is it time to hire an extra helper? Maybe we've got some to help, but maybe it's time to get one more. Maybe the neighbor offers you a chance to rent 40 more acres, and you have to ask yourself, is the benefits of taking this opportunity of a 40-acre field worth it or not? That's kind of analysis you look at. The last one is, maybe you've got a larger herd of, 400 or 500 cows, 200, 300, whatever, and the opportunity comes along about adding 25 more cows. You've got the space and you're thinking about it. Do I add 25 more? These are the sorts of questions you use. And it's, like I said, they're all kind of relatively small changes. So the basic methodology is to answer 4 questions. You got 2 benefits and 2 costs to examine, and then you put the costs and benefits, take the benefits, subtract the costs, and see if the net gain is positive or negative. So what are the benefits questions? What are the new or added revenues you're going to pick up? We'll look at that. And then what are some costs that you're going to reduce or completely eliminate? Those are both benefits. Your revenues go up or your costs go down. Then on the cost side, you have the reverse. Are you going to add new costs that'll increase your costs, and will you have some revenues you'll lose? And so that'll also be a cost in this analysis. So you just answer these 4 questions and you calculate the benefits minus the costs, and you get a net gain. Often they're laid out in these partial budget analyses graphically in a little table like this. On the left side are the benefits, on the right side are the costs, and then the 4 questions are laid out there as additional revenues, additional costs, costs reduced, revenues reduced. And then you sum up the left side to get your benefits, and sum up the right side to get your costs, and then you calculate the net gain. So this is often the graphical or tabular form people use. So let's work through a simple example to kind of illustrate the use. So suppose you custom hire normally somebody to plant 300 acres of corn for you and 200 acres of soybeans each year. You want to examine whether you should buy a planter and own it yourself. So you answer those 4 questions. What will be the new or added revenues? Well, the reason you're thinking about buying a planter is because you want to get your crop in on time. So you're expecting to get increased yields due to more timely planting. One of the costs of a custom operator is sometimes they're just not on time. They got to fit you into their schedule. And so you want to get your crop in earlier and gain that extra yield. So what are some of the costs you're going to reduce or eliminate? The big one is you're no longer going to be paying a custom planter. You don't have to pay that cost anymore. You're not going to hire anybody. So then you go to question 3, what are the new or added costs? You can see quickly, well, I got to start paying the costs of the owning of the planter, both the fixed and variable costs. And then the last question is what revenues will be reduced or lost? And I sat and thought about it, and I can't think of any in this situation, but in other situations, there'll be other potentially revenues that'll be lost. So we put it in the same structure. Here's the visual format, title across the top, corn, soybean planter example, and then you get your 4 questions laid out. And in the red is the answers and how I would lay them out graphically. So here's some calculations I did just to kind of show you how you would go about doing this. What are my additional yields? Well, or yield increases, I should say, under my additional revenues. Well, I've done some work, and I'm going to say 3 bushels more of corn due to more timely planting. Assume price of $3 a bushel and 300 acres. So 3 bushels of corn in yield due to earlier planting. $3 a bushel times 300 acres, you take 3 times 3 times 300, you get $2,700. That's that first entry here on the table. Oh, sorry. The next one is soybeans. We're going to assume a 1 bushel of soybeans is the yield gain times $9 a bushel times 200 acres at $1,800. So those are my estimates of the yield increases, the value per acre times the number of acres. What are some of the costs that reduced? Well, right now in this assumption, I'm going to assume you're paying $20 an acre for your custom planting. To hire the custom planter, 300 acres. Well, 20 times 300 is $6,000. 19 times $200 for the, 200 acres. That's the cost, and then the acres for the custom soybean planting. Well, that's $3,800. And then, so you add those up, you get 2,700 plus 1,800 plus 6,000 plus 3,800, and you get 14,300. Now let's go to the cost side. Well, what are these new costs going to be? You're going to pay to own and operate and maintain a planter, a corn. You're doing some work, and I'll show you some numbers where these could come from. Corn, you're estimating about $25 an acre to do it yourself. Soybeans, about $24 an acre, so 25 times 300 is 7,500. 24 times 200 is 4,800. And then our revenues here that are lost. I could come up with none, so that'd be a 0, I guess, or none. So you add those up, 7,500 plus 4,800, and you get 12,300. So now the total benefits, 14,300 minus the total cost, 12,300, and you get $2,000. That's your net gain here. That's a way to think about this. So that's kind of how you do a partial budget analysis. Come up with the benefits on one side, the costs on the other, and put it together and come up with a net gain. And so the couple things I really want to now focus in on is, notice how you don't need a full cost of production estimate for corn and soybeans. You don't need enterprise budgets. How much fertilizer, weed control, land rent, none of that stuff is in there. It's only the costs and revenues that change. That's the simplicity and beauty of a partial budget analysis. Where do I get these gains from? That $3 3 bushels for corn and 1 bushel per acre for soybeans is due to more timely planting. You can go look at these web links here. Let's see if it works on this. No, it's not going to take me there. So pull it into here. We can see it's going to give us, this is from an article by Joe Lauer more on corn. This is from several years ago, 1995. But you can see here, corn grain yield increases 0.3 to 0.5% per day when planted in early May, and 1.5 to 2.3% per day when planted in later May. So those are the costs of planting later or the benefits of planting earlier. I used 1%. It's just a simple way to come at it. Looking here at another, you can go at this Iowa State one. That's another example of a research article I found, or it's an extension paper really, from the Soybean Agronomy Group. But here is a study done in 2003, 4, and 5, and they're looking at this late planting of soybeans in Iowa. They're talking 1/4 bushel per day per acre in Iowa in 2003, but the ranges were substantially greater than that, from 0.4 to 0.8, in some locations as high as 9.9 bushels per acre per day. So you get at these costs of of late planting or being late in planting, or the benefits of more timely planting if you own your own planter, those can add up really fast. This example was just a simple 1% loss for 1 day and a quarter bushel. So that's where I got these numbers here. I assumed 3 bushels is with that, where I came with that 1%. It's just a simple number. And here's another one, 1 bushel. I just assuming 4 days later due to using a custom planter as opposed to doing it yourself. And that's kind of you have to come up with these assumptions here to drive this analysis. You have some information. How much later are you all the time because you're using a custom operator as opposed to doing it yourself? You'll have to answer those questions yourself by looking at the days you typically got in using the custom operator and what you think you can do if you owned and operated the planter yourself. There's some other examples here of the estimating the cost in owning and operating a planter. That's where the cost side came from if you owned a planter. Take a quick look at that. This is a extensions fact sheet from William Edwards at Iowa State University. He also wrote the textbook on farm management. He's now retired, but he's got a beautiful how to estimate the costs of farm machinery. He's got tables and lots of detail on how to do it. You get the PDF version of it here. And what's nice about this is you can scroll down, you see the same tables and such, but they have a worksheet. You can work by hand. You don't even need to have the here we go. Here's the worksheet. It shows you how to work it by hand. You don't have to have a fancy computer or anything, as long as you have this worksheet and the figures and tables from above to estimate all the different costs of owning and operating. They have an example here for a 180 horsepower tractor or a 25-foot chisel plow. And then they have an empty sheet you can print and do it yourself. So you get a sense of some of the ways you come up with these numbers. Then the custom operator is where I got the rates for what it costs to hire somebody. I just kind of rounded the 2017 rates for Wisconsin. Every year there's not every year, every few years there's a custom rate survey done in Iowa, and here in Wisconsin, that's done every 2 to 3 to 4 years, and that's used to get these rates from. Some states like Iowa spend the money and do it every year. And then you get these numbers. And so you can quickly see, back to our partial budget analysis here, you've got options. And what you can quickly see is that it's focusing in on, it's going to cost me more to own and operate my planter. That's the difference in these costs reduced versus the additional costs. You can see I'm estimating here about $5 an acre or more to own and operate the planter. And then your question is that $5 more an acre enough to justify these yield gains over here? Or is it too much? Well, I should reverse that. Are the yield gains enough to justify this extra $5 per acre cost? Under these assumptions, under these prices and these acreages, yes, it is. You come out ahead about $2,000 an acre. But it helps you focus in on these the crux of the issue, laying it out formally here. But then you get to this big question here: is this $2,000 gain of $4 an acre enough to justify that added hassle of owning and operating a planter? That's something you'll have to answer. Do you have the storage space? Where are you going to put the planter? Do you have the time for this annual maintenance? Do you really need this more timely planting? You've come up with some estimates here of, based on this. Is it really important to you? You have to think about your operation and how the downsides to being late. Is it really costly to you? And it depends on your situation. Some people are part-time farmers within their job. The extra time to maintain and make sure they do the planting themselves, they might not have it. And so the custom operation is a better deal. Whereas people who are full-time farmers and it's important to them, they're trying to grow their business in terms of make more revenues and income in order to buy more acres and expand the operation, they might need this. And so you can kind of think about these answers always depend upon the specifics of the individual farmer situation. But it gives you a tool, a way to lay these things out. Now, normally what I would do at this point is the goal of this section of the course is to learn how to actually do one of these partial budget analyses. And, this is fairly simple. Think break 1 is an example. We're going to work it in class, but I want you to think about doing it on your own, in your own time, and how you would lay this structure out. These are a bunch of assumptions laid out here. We're going to do the same kind of thing. Instead, now it's a custom combining versus buying the combine. And so you can do a partial budget analysis of it. You got corn acres at $250, soybean acres at $250. Custom rates are slightly different. $35 an acre to hire someone to combine your corn, 33 for your soybeans. And you can see the costs of owning and operating are higher, 40 and 38, 1% increase in yields due to more time to harvest, and you got some average yield assumptions for the corn and soybeans, and the same prices, 3 and 9. And then you would lay it out in this structure here. So what I would actually recommend for students is pause this, go work this think break, and then online on the course page are posted the answers, and we'll talk about them in class. But it gives you a way to do one of these and see if you can structure it into this format and then get the same answers. Okay, now what I'd like to do next is to think about some issues to consider when using partial budgets. This analysis is not perfect, no analysis, it has various assumptions, and so we want to examine some strengths and weaknesses. We want to focus on some of the weaknesses just to give students a fair understanding of it all. So we'll talk about sensitivity analysis, economies of size, opportunity costs, and risk changes. So sensitivity analysis is going to be important. Assumptions are used, and they're not always known with any kind of certainty. This yield benefit for more timely planning. I kind of made some big, broad level assumptions. Same with the crop yields and prices for the think break. I assumed a 1% yield benefit and this base yield of 180 bushels per acre for corn and 60. Each person, well, maybe 60 is too many for your soybeans. Maybe you should use 55. You should probably do some sensitivity analysis around those assumptions. The same with your machinery costs. There's some detailed methods to estimate them. You can get the custom rates. These are estimates. But again, you probably should do sensitivity analysis around them. These are estimates and averages. Where you can get this information from? How certain is it? I think it's really key. We'll talk about some good sources, but here in Wisconsin, we have a really good extension system, county agents, and then state specialists and people in the middle, the regional level. And we can work and help find some of this information. The internet is full of information. Iowa State University, University of Illinois, University of Minnesota, all these places, just like Wisconsin, have their strengths and weaknesses in providing this kind of information. But it's useful to work with your extension staff and faculty and everyone to come up with some really good estimates if this is important to you. And it's usually recommended to run these analysis with ranges of assumptions, not just one set of assumptions, get a number and be done. You can think of a low, average, high scenarios, maybe the worst and the best case scenario, and see where you get. Often you can use these break-even analysis. Use your assumptions to figure out the price and yield you need to make buying the planter worth doing. Things like that. And then you can decide how likely it is to get $4 corn and 180 bushels per acre, for example. If that's the return you need in order to justify buying the planter for the acreages and your assumptions, then you can ask yourself, how likely is it for me to get $4 a bushel and 180 bushels per acre? You can even go into formal modeling of the uncertainty using probability distributions or decision trees and payoff matrices, or even what they call Monte Carlo analysis. For those of you that are students, 421 is the course where you learn how to do some of these techniques. And spreadsheets are very useful for this kind of sensitivity analysis. And I always think of back to the one of my early comments. Often this is the back of the envelope initial level, and then if it looks promising or it's worth looking at more carefully, you circle back and do it in more comprehensive and more detailed. Sensitivity analysis would be often a part of that. Economies of size is another major issue to think about, or these linearity assumptions. Most of these partial budget analyses are assumed linear or proportional changes in costs and revenues. It's likely not accurate because there's fixed costs running around in there. But it is a useful and simple approximation. If you have 1,000 acres and you drop 100 acres, your costs are going to decrease at the aggregate level, but probably by less than 10% because you've got some fixed costs that are going to have to be paid no matter how many acres you're farming. So the costs go down. Maybe it'll be simple just to use a 10% decrease assumption, but to see if it's worth dropping those 100 acres to do something else. But if you want to do it more formally, you might want to be worried about these economies of size or linearity assumptions, their accuracy. The same with adding 40 cows to a herd of 400. Again, your labor demand will probably increase, but maybe you can get by with less than 10% labor demand increase because people have already been doing it. They added a few more cows and it doesn't go up by 10% for them. So these linearity assumptions are fine for small changes, but once you start getting the larger ones, then you need a more formal budgeting analysis often. Here's a simple graphic to show here. The horizontal axis is your input level. The vertical axis is your cost or revenue. That blue line is the curve. It's a nonlinear curve. And you can kind of see where you are now is the first dot there, where the red line is tangent. And then if you add some more input level, maybe you're hiring another milker, or you're adding 40 acres, adding 25 more cows, that increases your costs or your revenues. And maybe that small change, it's not too big a difference. That's that first dot, that error between the red line, your linearity assumption, and the actual is not that much of a difference. But then you go to, if you make a big change there where it goes way up, you can see the error, that gap between the red line and the blue line is quite substantial. And that's the point to always remember about partial budgets. You're linearizing the system, which is fine for small changes, but when you start making larger changes, that error starts to get larger and larger and larger. A couple other things I want to talk about is opportunity costs are important. You should always be included in the analysis. And I always like to focus on two big ones: opportunity costs of capital, particularly things like land, but also you and your family's time. Capital needs are changing when you do some of these things. You have to really think about it. There's going to be costs or benefits to borrowing more or less and tying up more or less of your capital in different farm assets. If you buy a planter, that money is coming from somewhere. You're going to have to borrow it, or you have to take some of your current assets and convert them into the planter. And those were doing something else. You have to think about that. Often that's the interest rate for capital. On the labor and management side, these are also things to think about. It's often you and your family's time. You have to start thinking about things like, okay, if I do take this extra 40 acres, it does mean being busier in the spring and in the fall. It means missing maybe your daughter's basketball games because you're busy doing things, or your son's football games, or in the fall because you're busy harvesting those extra acres. And those have costs and benefits as well. And you have to think about that kind of stuff. It's not just dollars. And that's what we think of as opportunity costs. You're giving up opportunities with that money and that capital. And these are the sorts of things that change over the life cycle of a farm, changes in credit and or labor resources. A simple one, a lot of you, if you are involved in a farm, your parents are probably paying or helping you pay to go to college. You are probably helping out in the operation. Well, they have to think about, okay, there's a gain from sending my child to go to University of Wisconsin to learn about these things. There's also a cost. I have to balance out. My child is giving up the opportunity to work on the farm. And there's these kind of things happen. The same with the financial resources to do the same thing. You're investing in sending your child to college. It's the same time as well. And these things change. If someone becomes ill or as they age, they might want to work less or work less strenuously. And these are the sorts of things that change over the life cycle of a farm. And it's time to think about the opportunity costs of reallocating your time and financial resources. Partial budgeting can help do that. The last one to talk about is risk. A lot of times in these partial budgets, we don't think about risk directly. We bring it in at the end in an ad hoc manner. There's like a simple example is no-till versus conventional tillage. No-till is you do very little, essentially no tillage to plant the crop. Conventional tillage, you do more aggressive tillage, knock down the weeds, or the disking at least, or chisel plowing and disking maybe, or something like that, or even full tillage. There's going to be risks in there. If you do no-till, it's often a little cooler and wetter. And some years that slows you down and costs you yield. Conventional tillage just causes more erosion, which is affecting your long-term productivity of your soil, and it spends more money doing tillage. You got to balance those risks and benefits. Not using the seed treatment. People have been really looking at ways to cut costs, maybe cutting back in insecticide seed treatments. You're going to run a risk of stand loss. Is that extra risk worth it or not? Last one, I was thinking about the custom operator versus owning. These last few years, we've had snow in the fall of 2018 that came early, and a lot of corn and soybeans were left out in the fields unharvestable. And the same thing in the wet spring, the following spring. We were unable to get the crops in time. A lot of people were late planted. Some of those people were late planted because they did not have their own planter, or some of those people missed their harvest because they didn't have their own combine, and they had to get in line and work with the custom operator at one level. And what's the risk of that? Those are very unusual years. Can you bear that risk? So without formal tools, those are extreme examples with this extreme weather we've had the last couple of years. But here's the wet spring of 2019 taught me it's better to own a planter to ensure I get my crop planted on time. Here's another one: financial risk of borrowing $120,000 to buy a decent used planter. It's just too great to justify that net benefit of $3,500. I sat down, did my analysis. There's a lot of money tied up there, and I'm already leveraged due to other factors beyond my control. I just can't take that extra financial risk. Even though it's a net benefit, it's too risky. And that's something you have to make outside of the partial budget analysis. The last one here is the risk of not finding custom combiner is just too great to justify the net gain of $7,000 I estimate if I switch to using custom combining. You know, all these numbers are made up, but that's the principle. You might do a partial budget analysis and figure out if I do a custom combining, I'm going to come out ahead by $7,000 on average. But then I think about what happened in 2018, and I can't bear that risk. I'm going to lose the $7,000 or pay it as insurance to ensure that I get my crop out each year on time by buying the combine, even though it costs me money. That's the types of ways you can bring in risk ex post or after the analysis is done. Here's some examples of existing resources. I'm not going to go into them, but the combine example is a great example. Again, William Edwards worked out a great one here back in 2009, lays it all out, the costs, the comparison between owning and custom operating, hiring someone to do your combining, laid out in extreme, 8 pages, if I remember correctly. Some other examples here. Sarah Cornelis at Penn State has a nice little description about partial budgeting, and then an example of, do I hire someone to custom raise my dairy heifers? Do I continue to do it myself? Common choice that many dairy farmers face. Do they do it themselves or pay someone else to do it? Another example is Iowa State University and University of Nebraska Extension. They have an example here. Do I raise my own replacement heifers to become my beef cows in my cow-calf operation, or do I buy them? Example laid out here is a partial budget, as well as a general description on how to do a partial budget. And the last one is Craig Chase at Iowa State University also has some good examples of partial budget analysis and some changes in horticultural examples for sort of smaller gardening operations that are, to change the crop mix between snow peas and greens, or changing your carrot production practices, the bed arrangements, and the number of rows per bed. They just give you examples of different kinds of farms and how widespread and useful this tool really is, partial budget analysis. So in short, I've explained and illustrated the purposes of partial budgets, did examples, particularly focusing in on the think break. We'll work through that in class, explain some issues and weaknesses of partial budgets. The sensitivity analysis is often important, size economies or the linearity assumptions, think about opportunity costs and how to bring in risk changes. And then think about this for the problem set and exam, you're going to want to be able to do simple partial budget analysis using some given information and interpret the findings. When you get all done, you come up with a number. What does it mean? How do you interpret it? How would you bring in things like risk, for example? So thank you.